WellPod at DC on Riot Radio.
From meditation, stress management, safer substance use, and sexual health, we will literally talk sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Join us to dive deep into some student health questions. We'll learn about wellness together, try some coping tools, and meet some interesting people.
Your co-hosts, Heather and Craig.
Perfect blend of Campus Health and Wellness Center and Sal's.
Each week, we'll DIY a wellness tool together.
And then nerd out and dig into the science behind how it works.
Email your health and wellness related questions to wellpod@durhamcollege.ca to be discussed anonymously on air. Welcome to the WellPod at DC.
Welcome to the WellPod at DC, live from the Media Hub here on riotradio.ca. Craig, did you see the supermoon last night?
I did not.
Oh,
there was a supermoon?
There was a supermoon, and it was beautiful. It was the largest I've seen it in a long time. For those of you that were able to see the moon last night, it arrived at Pirigui, which is the closest point to Earth, and looked about 14% brighter than the average full moon. So it was stunning.
Interesting. Yeah, I thought I was seeing the full moon 2 nights ago, but then it's a different one. It's neat.
Got even more full last night. Just like the supermoon lighting up our sky last night, it's time to shed a little bit of light on sexual well-being. Our student question of the week is, should I be scared about getting an STI? I have so many questions about sex. It wasn't talked about much at school or at home, and it feels like everyone knows way more than I do. Super embarrassing. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what is an STI and why sex was and is still a little bit taboo, and how shame, embarrassment connects to sex, and ending with a little conversation on how to approach sexual decisions. So what is an STI? So how many STIs do you think there would be if you had to guess?
I can't lie, I glanced down at your notes.
You already saw the number here. Were you surprised
Sorry.
that there's about 20 different infections known to be transmitted through sexual contact?
Yeah, I think I knew there were a good number, but that is kind of a surprising number where if I reflect, I would have said maybe 10 or 12 kind of thing.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of different forms of infection that we can gain. In Canada, the most common reported is chlamydia and HPV. And another common STI, gonorrhea, sometimes referred to as the clap, was first recorded at least 700 years ago, associated with a district in Paris, formerly known as La Clapière, which is where we got the word the clap from.
Interesting.
Even older, we saw Hippocrates, in 4060 to 375 BC, often describing an illness that we feel resembles gonorrhea, and stated that it was resulting from pleasures of Venus. So sexually transmitted infections spread predominantly through sexual contact, including vaginal, anal, and oral sex. Some STIs can also be spread through non-sexual contact and non-sexual means, such as through blood. So if I brush my teeth and I have really bleeding gums, and then somebody else uses that toothbrush, their gums are also bleeding and open sores, we can sometimes get this blood-to-blood transference, but also through skin-to-skin contact, especially in our genital area. Craig, I was confused sometimes because I see some STIs we see can be spread through saliva, so with kissing, especially deeper kissing, French kissing, but some can't be spread through saliva. So how come some can be spread through blood and saliva, others just through blood? Aren't these all just the same biofluids? What's happening here?
No, it's an interesting one. And before we even get started, I don't know about you, I'm more used to STD was the term growing up that was discussed as opposed to STIs.
Yes.
And so even still sometimes, I'll apologize in advance when I mess it up over the session today.
And from some of the literature I was coming across, it was stating that because not all infections will lead to diseases, and so that's why they kind of changed the name.
The name change. Interesting.
But it's throwing a lot of us off that we're used to that STD conversation.
Right. That's right. But yeah, in terms of the idea that you're talking about there on a simple form, if you will, right? We're talking about a large category all clumped under one umbrella, if you will, right? Yeah. A sexually transmitted infection is an infection like that was obviously transmitted through sexual contact, sometimes even not, like you were saying with the brushing of teeth and those kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
But just because we have this large umbrella of function, if you will, for lack of a better word for it, it doesn't mean that all of those infections are the same kind of species of organism, right? And so in terms of the different organisms that are involved, you're dealing with viruses, you're dealing with bacteria, fungus, you're dealing with parasites as well, right? And so all of those are very different biologically from each other. And so then there's that aspect of sometimes, because we have this overarching term of STI, like, oh, aren't they kind of all the same? But as I was prepping, kind of thinking about silly analogies, as I tend to do, right? But it's like, there's lots of animals in the world. Well, we have this term for animals, but unlike whales, we live on the land, and unlike humans, whales live in the ocean. They live in different environments, right? And can survive in different environments. It's the same when you're dealing with different bacteria, different viruses, different parasites and fungus as well.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So some of the different ways, as Craig just mentioned, we have viral infections, viral STIs. So these would be things like HPV, which can lead to genital warts. We have HIV/AIDS and hepatitis. Bacterial, we have things like gonorrhea, already mentioned, chlamydia and syphilis. And then a parasite, we also have TREC. And so 4 of the curable STIs, chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis, and TREC, often have no symptoms. And so we often refer to this as being asymptomatic. And so I think this is a big myth, in that we're always going to know that a rash will show up or some form of a sign or symptom will be there. But for many of us, we've already contracted the STI, and we're maybe perhaps passing it on because we don't have any symptoms.
Like when you think about some of the herpes viruses in terms of cold sores and so on, right? It's something that you could get infected, as you were saying, in terms of why the name changed. You can get infected with that virus. It doesn't show right away, because its life cycle is it waits until you're, sick or stressed or whatnot, and then it takes advantage of, okay, the immune system is down. Now is the time, and then it
presents itself,
unfortunately, right? And then your body, resolves that. You never completely got rid of the virus. Like that's one, as you likely know, sticks around for a long time, right?
One of my favorite comedians, Ali Wong, makes the joke that HPV is like a ghost that lives in male bodies and then goes boo in women's bodies. And so many of us may be carrying an STI and not be aware due to being asymptomatic or not having any symptoms. When we do see symptoms in the STI, although they are all different creatures, all different organisms, as Craig highlighted, some common symptoms that we will see are things like vaginal or urethral discharge, genital ulcers, painful urination, and abdomen pain. But the only way we can know if we have an STI is to get tested. And if left untreated, not only, as we've been discussing, can we pass it forward, but it can actually pop up later down the road and cause a lot more neurological manifestations and impacts to our reproductive health. So it's kind of this blend of trying to educate that they are common. We're going to see a lot of Canadians living with an STI, that they're treatable. So several of these, as mentioned, are curable, but they do have implications. And so it's trying to find that balance between not necessarily being scared, as the student questioned. We don't necessarily need to be scared of this, but I think it's important that we're informed.
And I think it does. It's unfortunate, because there is that aspect of, oh, I don't want to say something, or like you're talking about, I know, is more scared before I even maybe contract an STI. But sometimes there's also that aspect of, don't talk about it, and then, okay, maybe it'll go away, like kind of going back to the herpes. Okay, it recovers that. But I was reading about, actually, I investigated fungus, because we had originally talked bacteria, virus, and parasites. And so I came across one that the first case of this, it was a type of ringworm. And the first case of it was discovered in the U.S. this past summer. And now whatever they're at, 13 cases or whatever it is. And of course, all the health folk are trying to keep it contained and those kind of things. But it was interesting, as I read a few articles about it. it sort of presents at first like other ringworms that you might get from not from sexual contact and so on. But then sometimes people don't talk about it. And one of the key things that the article was talking about, it was more geared towards doctors, was note patients won't talk about this. Ask them about their sexual health and so on to get them talking, because it's one of these, okay, it's ringworm and it will go away. And this particular one, not to make it scary regarding the student's question, but it leads to potentially abscesses and then scar tissue down the road on legs and so on as well in the genital area, right? And so you don't want to get to that point where, oh gosh, this is bad, and now trying to recover from something that maybe could have been treated with medication earlier on.
Absolutely.
Through discussion with a healthcare practitioner, right?
Speaking of which, bacterial STIs such as chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis can be treated with antibiotics. Viral STIs, herpes, hepatitis, HPV, and HIV cannot be cured, but there are medications to alleviate the symptoms and reduce the likelihood of transmission, along with consistent and correct condom use, which we'll be talking about a lot today. HPV and hepatitis also have preventative vaccines. So many of us here in Ontario actually received these vaccines in elementary school. And there was a lot of confusion. Do you remember when the HPV vaccine really kind of started to poke its head a number of years ago?
Yeah.
And I remember at the time there was a lot of pushback, especially when you were receiving it when you were maybe 12, 11, 12 years old. This pushback of, well, it's to treat an STI and these youth are not sexually active. But as we've been discussing today, not only can these lead to sexual related health concerns, but HPV in particular leads to a lot of different forms of cancer. And so being aware that our whole body is connected.
Yes, for sure. For sure.
Also, we do have a new pre-exposure antiviral drug for HIV to reduce the risk of transmission called PrEP. That's really important to speak to your healthcare provider about. Craig, you mentioned a parasite earlier. Trech is one form of a parasite that we see as an STI. Have you ever heard whispers or rumors about being able to catch it from a toilet seat?
I don't know that it was like Trech specifically, but I remember rumors when I was younger of, when it was an unknown and so on, that it's like, oh yeah, you can get this or that from. Yeah.
And when we look at the science behind this parasite can in fact survive several hours, but on damp, moist surfaces. And so a toilet seat that maybe has some leftover dampness from a previous user, but also our genitals need to make direct contact with this moist area that has the parasite right in it. So is it a possibility? It's possible. Is it common? No. It's very rare for us to be contracting it this way. It's highly unlikely, but something to, as you mentioned, be really thinking about how these organisms grow and what sort of environments they grow and survive in.
Yeah, for sure.
So moist, damp, open sores, open wounds.
And the treatments, like you mentioned, right? They're different. Sometimes that can lead to confusion with patients too, there's a large difference between an antiviral or some of the specific ones you were talking about versus an antibacterial, because without going down too much of a side tangent, but bacteria are actually living cells that, like our cells, divide and grow on their own. And so antibiotics help to kill them off by damaging some aspect that doesn't allow them to grow. Viruses are non-living things, and so they can't replicate on their own. They survive within us, not sort of as bacteria is in us and it's dividing itself, but it's infecting our cells, using our cells' machinery to make copies of itself.
Wow.
And so a lot of those antivirals, and I know you mentioned a few things about HIV, but the one you were mentioning about like limiting like chance of exposure along with condoms and other protection, but that's about, blocking, like you still have the virus, but then when it replicates itself, blocking its ability to get into the next cell over after you've made multiple copies of itself, versus a medication that's actually, if you will, attacking the virus itself and eradicating it. Not to say that there aren't others, as you mentioned, that are being developed, but a little bit of confusion sometimes there of like, what's an antifungal, what's an antiviral, what's an antibacterial. They're different from each other. Not that it's something to be scared of, but asking again questions of your practitioner of how does this work and what's going on. And,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Overall, some general health consensus is use a condom for every sexual experience. We can't reuse condoms, and we can actually use products like Dental Dam. The confusion often is that it's just for kind of oral activities, but we can use this as a barrier for our genital areas as a whole. But as well, getting tested and knowing your status. The month of October here at the Campus Health and Wellness Center, we have the Trek or Treat campaign, where if you book an STI appointment, you get some nice Halloween candy there. So knowing your status is something we're going to be talking about a lot today. After this quick break, we're exploring the shame that can sneak up and go boo around the topic of sex. Welcome back to the WellPod at DC, live from the Media Hub here on riotradio.ca. Stigma, shame, and fear associated with sexually transmitted infections is real and affects many of us. There can be a lot of assumptions on what type of person gets an STI, stereotypes and prejudice around race or gender identity and expressions, sexual orientation, that only increases the stigma around STIs. So this makes talking about STIs and preventing them and getting tested challenging. Not talking about STIs can make them seem less common than they are, making STIs seem much scarier. In the past, sex education largely lacked information on pleasure, consent, contraception, and sexual anatomy. And while we're making progress, sex has been a taboo for hundreds of years. Craig, do you remember your sex ed program at school or in your household?
Yeah, more so at school, though. My memory is not always the greatest.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm sure my parents could correct me, but I don't remember a whole lot of discussion there.
Yeah.
I mean, at times, but then, through school for sure. In terms of the STDs that we were talking about, how we learned it.
Yeah,
for sure, that was.
And I know you have a family yourself. Have you started the conversations? Are those feeling comfortable? Are you starting to feel the pressure of how complex this topic can be?
Yeah, definitely. It can be complex, right? Because there's a big difference between talking about the science, if you will, of it,
Yes.
and where do babies come from, and moving into, okay, now you're old enough that we talk about STIs and, various other aspects of sex and partnership and so on can be definitely a challenge.
Yeah.
Kind of like most things too, right? From mom and dad is like, maybe shut up, what do you know? Or I don't know, or awkward, is the reality.
It can be tricky with your family.
For sure, for sure.
In many ancient cultures, including Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, sexuality was not considered sinful or shameful. Instead, it was seen as natural and a sacred part of life. And we see it depicted in a lot of art and a lot of different cultural rituals. But as world religions grew and more conservative attitudes started to come towards sexuality, we saw more of an emphasis on things like chastity and celibacy and the idea that sex was just a means of procreation versus pleasure and connection. So concepts such as the original sin and the association of sexual desire with guilt and shame really began to take hold. And we especially saw more restrictive sexual norms coming out during the Middle Ages. So when the Catholic Church in Europe was really growing and had a really significant influence over state in that area, we saw a lot more stricter and less conversation happening when it came to sex. Pulitzer Prize-winning author and anthropologist Ernest Becker stated that sex is maybe a taboo. And Craig, tell me what you think of this theory, that it's because humans have an inherent fear of death. Humans are constantly concerned with mortality and death, so we develop coping mechanisms by thinking about ourselves not as earthly mortal beings, but as immoral spiritual beings. By engaging in earthly animalistic behaviors such as sex, it reminds us, as he says, that we're just bags of chemicals doomed to decompose when our time on Earth expires. What are your thoughts on kind of this premise of maybe part of the taboo and part of the pushback of talking about sex is because it reminds us that we're animals?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I've never come across something like that before. I have to chew on that for a little bit, but
before you decompose.
I like the negative, took a swing at the end there, that I'm a big bag of chemicals. And
right?
Thanks for the reminder, Heather.
You're welcome. But the vast majority of human beings are going to feel some level of vulnerability with this topic. When it comes to sex, vulnerability is an inherent part of the conversation. Some think that this is not just because we're immortal and because we're these bags of decomposing chemicals, but more so because it is a very vulnerable form of human connection associated with some health risks, as we've been talking about today, and differences in our religion and cultural views as well. Perhaps this is why sex can be a scary topic for us to approach, noticing some embarrassment and some shame. Craig, what's going on in our brain when we're feeling these sensations around shame and guilt?
Yeah, so I came across an interesting article, and I did not a full dive because this one was more of they did the full dive for me in terms of investigating various prior research articles looking at brains and so on of people going through shame, embarrassment, and then guilt. The name of the paper was The Neural Signatures of Shame, Embarrassment, and Guilt by Peretti et al. And actually it was just not this past summer, but the summer before, where they looked at 17 different research papers focused on shame and embarrassment, and then 17 that looked at guilt and kind of analyzed the overall what's going on in the brain when these various things are going on. And so the first picture that we'll bring up on the screen here is sort of the part of the brain that the other one, if you don't mind. No worries. But the parts of the brain that are involved with these areas. And so as people watching can see, the insula, thank you for modeling that.
You're welcome.
But the insula is this portion where the name insula is, that's the front of our brain, and then where the green highlight is the back of our brain there. And so as you can see, they've pulled a portion of the brain away, and or the upper levels of the brain, and showing the insula there, which this article, I will say, as much as I like science, there was a lot of, the brain is very complex, as you know. So there was a lot of, and then it's attached to this part and attached to that part, and it was very interesting, but maybe a little over my brain, if you will. But this part was involved in shame and embarrassment and guilt as well, but it was slightly different parts. What they found from the research was embarrassment and shame were actually hard to tease apart from each other. Partially, I think, definitions of it, if I recall, they're what is the difference between these two terms?
Yeah.
But then also the overlap of the areas of the brain, they're just very close to each other. But then it was interesting that they were then comparing to guilt as well, and the connections, again, parts that I don't know that are connecting them and so on, but that like, oh, there seems to be this overlapping connection to then guilt as well, right? Like, it's embarrassing to talk about I have an STI as an example, not that it was only dealing with STIs in this article, but like, yeah, that's something that's like, oh gosh, and then also guilt being more, I thought, let me get to the part that I jotted down because I knew I would forget it. But it was that idea of like shame and embarrassment, because of the parts of the brain that it affects, inhibit the motor and the speech parts of our brain. Ooh. Which was really interesting, because if you've ever been really embarrassed, I find that I'm just like shut down, like avoid any more of it happening by shutting down, don't say anything, shut your mouth, Craig.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's literally what our brain is doing. It's shutting down the motor function so we're able to continue to talk.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Right. And so then it's the expressing like, okay, well, do I share that I have a STI? Because this is very embarrassing. And our brain is kind of like, don't share. Don't share it, shutting down that portion, right? Whereas the guilt area of the brain is a little bit more involved from the research that they were looking at in terms of recognizing, okay, I've made an error and I'm going to actively like seek out. It actually initiates the pro-social behavior that we have to sort of repair the issue there, right? So it was really interesting in terms of the different parts of the brain being affected overall, but then I think it interplays, I should say, with like that aspect of STIs and feeling shame that like I've contracted an STI, don't say anything, maybe even to my healthcare practitioners, because what will they think, right? Or guilt of, and the interplay there of maybe passing on an STI when you weren't trying to, or whatever comes into play. I mean, I don't want to go down too much of a tangent there.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so the second picture that we had is kind of the interplay, and I know it's a little tiny there, but you can see the pink dot on the left side there, and then the yellow was the same article trying to tease apart what parts of our brain are lighting up when we're experiencing, shame and embarrassment and guilt, and then they did sort of what areas are lighting up for both, and that's in purple there, and then the yellow portion is the portion that's lighting up when we're feeling guilt. Wow. And again, just an interplay, lots going on in our mind, and then I think again it overlaps with a situation like STIs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Our brain is very curious.
For sure.
A 2005 book written by Edward Shorty, Written in the Flesh, A History of Desire, tried to explore how cultural restraints, rather than anything anatomy-based, had the biggest impact on our sexual history, stating that we experience this mixture of biological and social conditioning. So biologically, we are getting this sensation of desire, and so we're getting this surge through our body, but then our mind is interpreting and sometimes weaving in some of these concepts of shame and embarrassment, and our culture is kind of editing on how we're reading these signals from biology. So having conversations on sex can help reduce the shame and misunderstanding surrounding the risks of STIs and increasing our positive experiences with sexuality. Sexual well-being is more than just reducing our exposures to STIs or avoiding pregnancy. It means to feel empowered in the choices and gain knowledge around our health and identity, having the confidence and skills to express our sensuality and engage in intimacy that can make us feel really safe and make us feel really good, as we've discussed in previous episodes. So human sexuality rarely falls into neat categories or simple labeling. It's a really rich and complex area of the human experience. When we come back from this short break, we're going to continue to explore how we can engage with sexual conversations and how we approach sexual decisions. Welcome back to the WellPod at DC, live from the Media Hub here on riotradio.ca. The college years are a time of tremendous transition and growth, which can include learning about sexuality. Students make a lot of decisions about their sexuality during this time, including whether to abstain from sexual intercourse, become or continue to be sexually active. So you may find yourself as a student exploring things like gender of your partners, considering the type of contraceptives to use, and navigating the intensity of your relationship. So current approaches to relationship and sex education is aiming to enable young people to develop the confidence and resilience in relation to sexual health and decision making. A really interesting article that you and I came across in Forbes magazine by Peter Ubel, a physician and behavioral scientist at Duke University, really started to poke holes at some of the current scientific literature, especially one article in particular called An Unbelievable Study in the Journal of Psychology Science that explored if college students make rational sex decisions. Just based on that, before you even dove into the article, what was kind of your initial thoughts on this idea if college students make rational sex decisions? Even just that word rational.
Yeah. I don't tend to kind of put that into a topic such as this, right? Rational. And like you said about like the time of life that is. I have my own biases of what I like experience in terms of going away to university rather than, someone who stayed nearby and still had their same, lots of different aspects there. So then it's, it just stuck out to me. Nothing particular, but just like rational sex. Like,
how do these two things go together? So Ubel started by showcasing flaws in how the study was originally conducted. So test subjects were presented with a photo of a potential sexual partner and then asked if they thought that they had the likelihood of contracting an STI. And then the photo would change, and then they would again rate if they thought how high the risk was of contracting an STI. So researchers measured whether people were being consistent in the decisions that they were making, and if a person only accepted a higher risk of STI to be more with an attractive partner, and this was consistent, they viewed that research as saying that they made rational decisions, which I thought was really interesting. That kind of one of the few like moderators would be just a photo. That's all you're being shown is just a photo of somebody.
Yeah.
So Ubel felt that the researchers failed to recognize the distinction between the necessary and significant conditions of rationality, and felt that the series of inconsistent choices that would present here and there could indicate not making rational decisions, but it was also a lot more complex than that. Ubel feels that consistency can be thought of as a necessary condition of rationality. Rational decision-making does not only require consistency, though, it depends on making good judgments about the relative benefits and harms of the choices that we make. So nothing about this study and some of the others that were clustered around it really did a good job at assessing if the young adults were weighing the harms and benefits of an STI versus the pleasure of a single sexual encounter with just the photo of the individual. So many studies are trying to uncover how young adults make sexual well-being decisions and why high-risk sexual behaviors such as not using a condom, not discussing STI's status with their partners continues. And as you would imagine, it's complex. So certain studies are looking at elements like physical attractiveness. How much does this kind of sway us when we're more or less attracted to somebody? Desirability, trust, familiarity, and the perceived seriousness of the relationship are all factors that are currently feeling like they come into play. But as Mae West once says, sex is an emotion in motion. Perhaps sexual decisions are less of the rational mind and more of the emotional mind. What are your thoughts on that, Craig? Emotional minds.
Yeah.
We've talked about the amygdala a lot on this podcast.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think that's at least not based on science, but as we were saying, based on seeing the words and whatnot is, like I tend to think about it that way in terms of, the emotions and the complexities of it, like it changing over time and depending on the scenario and so on. But I think my brain goes to the importance of what we're talking about here, that we're talking about it.
Yeah.
Right? In terms of, here's some research that's like, look at this photo. I'm oversimplifying a bit, but do you think this person has an STI? Is like, we've talked about it before, judging people, making decisions, maybe is a better word than judging, but making decisions when we, see a picture or when we interact with somebody and so on.
Yeah.
But yeah, then is that something that is rational versus having a discussion about it and having a culture that's a little more open than the culture you were saying we're kind of coming from or influenced by, of like, just don't talk about it.
Absolutely. Snow Roberts and Sam Path, in a 2024 article, The Sex Lives of College Students, Pleasure, Precaution, and Sexual Health Decisions, stated that half of all newly STI infections in the U.S. occur between the ages of 15 and 24, and about 86% of college students have been sexually active, but only 37.7% report talking about an STI status before sex with a new partner, which is a little spooky. Decisions around condom use and engagement in conversations around your STI status are the product of many interacting factors. Craig, you've talked about biases a lot in these different shows. We've talked about the cultural influences. We have personal attitudes, relationship status, trust, and perceived social norms. There's a lot of factors here which can make this a really vulnerable conversation to have. But sex doesn't need to be spooky. Let's pull these skeletons out of the closet and embrace our inner Sue Johansson. Craig, do you remember or ever recall watching Sue Johansson on TV?
No, the name is not ringing a bell.
The name would ring a bell.
Yeah, if you
knew. Sue Johansson, she passed away last summer at the age, I believe she was 93. She was a Canadian sex educator who hosted the Sunday Night Sex Show, a live call-in show in Canada from 1996 to 2005. And so like the W Network, she was on for a little bit. Okay. And so Sunday evenings, you could turn on your television and see this very sweet looking, white haired, very old lady talking about some really interesting stuff. And so for me, outside of school, this was kind of a exposure that I had to sex conversations. And people would call in and ask very open questions. And she had a nursing background, and her big mission was really trying to reduce the shame and this embarrassment. And one of her quotes is, "It's sad that the most glorious of sexual experiences can make us feel guilty, ashamed, embarrassed, and abnormal." And so, as you said, Craig, she was a big advocate for talking about things. And if you're feeling a little bit shamed or embarrassed, to do that social seeking and that connection seeking with trusted individuals to perhaps reduce some of the misinformation, or just even feel validated that you're not the only one that has this question. And we see this a lot, especially at the Campus Health and Wellness Center. A lot of students have a lot of questions perhaps that haven't been answered. And alas, without Sue Johansson on the air, we don't really have a lot of different avenues to find information. But I think many of us are seeking this information.
For sure.
So one word of caution is a lot of studies are showing that the increased use of pornography to answer some of these questions. And amongst some of my friend groups, we've been joking about with our children growing up, we're kind of keeping our eye on the Google searches, and we can see some kind of funny little things being typed into the Google searches. So I think we are curious about this topic, but making sure we're choosing more reputable resources because the pornography industry is an entertainment industry. So it's not scientifically backed, and so it may not be producing the most scientifically accurate information. Another sex-talking Sue, journalist Sue J. Johnson, argues in her 2017 TED Talk that we need to shift the way that we're talking and thinking about sex. And one of the methods that we can do is engaging and turning our conversations more about body sensations and the language to communicate our desires and our emotions. Perhaps sex can be less taboo by embracing and exploring our sensuality, thinking about how you feel in your own body, and developing a language to describe how things feel beyond just good or bad and beyond sex. So how does it feel to gently pour a cup of sand on your arm? Or how does it feel to wrap yourself in a warm towel after a shower? So getting more comfortable being able to consider and talk about the experiences of pleasure outside of a sexual context might make us a little bit more comfortable than articulating this in more of a bedroom scenario. So deciding to have sex is not something that we need to be scared of, rather prepared for, and should always feel safe. Informed sex is safer sex, which makes sex more enjoyable. You should not feel pressure to engage in intimacy, never feeling forced to do anything that feels uncomfortable or unsafe. So some general tips we really advocate for through the Campus Health and Wellness Center: when engaging in sexual activity, make decisions that you're comfortable with. Talk to your partners about safer sex practices. Things like, when was the last time you got tested for an STI? What are our birth control options that we're kind of wanting to explore today? Talking openly and honestly about our fears and worries, but also our feelings around desires and things that we're excited to be trying together. For more information, you can find a whole module on sexual well-being at durhamcollege.ca/sexual wellbeing. And a really great community-based resource is sexandyou.ca. So some general takeaways that we would highly advocate for is using a condom, test at least once a year or with each new partner, and engage in STI conversations with your partners. It's the end of our episode today. The resources mentioned in today's episode will be posted on our Instagram at wellness@dc. Don't forget, you can email your questions to be discussed anonymously on air at wellpod@durhamcollege.ca. Next week, we're going to continue our spooky conversations, but explore the sensation of fear. You can follow the Media Hub on social media at DCSA Media Hub. Thanks for exploring what it means to be well with us today. WellPod at DC, live on the mediahub.ca.